podcast from Drew and Mike is, I think it's really cool, and that is what I wanted to say.
Two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. I will keep this intro to the bare minimum. Our talk in this episode is about the wonderful characters Sacagawea, York, and the people they met on their journey. Of course, history has recorded this tale as the Lewis and Clark expedition, and no doubt it will remain so. However, there are other stories and factors that must be made known, and Aidan and I try to address the iniquities in the telling of this particular story, in a way which we feel apportions the correct amount of credit to each agent. Aidan is particularly vociferous in this episode, and despite the occasional morbidity of the subject matter, his striking terminology brings us colourful respite. Thank you, Aidan, for being so Aidan-like. Enjoy. Aidan, as we just in our pre-podcast preparation, just to stick in 3Ps, because that sounds really impressive.
It does.
It's been 3 weeks, bud. We haven't done
It
a
has.
podcast in 3 bloody weeks.
It's been a long 3 weeks, too. I mean, Thanksgiving happened over in the U.S. We had our elections. I mean, my mom went over to Germany for a couple weeks, and that, threw things out of whack in my household. But, man, it's good to be back. I got to say, it's so good to be back. I'm stoked.
Cool. It's great to have you back. And, yeah, happy Thanksgiving indeed. I hope, I saw a couple of photos of when Tracy met Amber in Germany.
Yes.
It seems like they had a really good time.
Yeah, lots of checking out castles and looking at all the old historical things, and it was fun to see all the she doesn't take a lot of pictures, which is understandable. She's very in the moment. Yeah, that's them right there. They're very she's very in the moment, and so she's not taking a lot of pictures, but all the stuff that she took pictures of was just oh my gosh, this is amazing. It was wonderful. So glad that she came back. She brought me a stein. She got me this a real nutcracker from the Nutcracker Christmas town in Germany. She was this thing cost me $100. She was this is a real nutcracker, and I was
don't lose it.
I was oh, yeah, I've been having a nutcracker collection for 13 years, and so this is a real nutcracker. It's awesome. So I'm just it's awesome. So
okay.
Yeah,
that takes pride of place in your collection, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely, it's gonna be the centerpiece this year. I mean, I've got some big ones, but this one is I'm gonna show everybody. I'm gonna be look at my brand new real nutcracker. So yeah, I'm stoked about that.
We're going to need a picture of that so that I can put it up, because I can also apparently do individual episode photos, so we can have a picture of your nutcracker.
Yeah, I'll send it over. Absolutely.
Good. Then I'll make sure that one goes up for this particular episode then.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah, so people probably who follow the podcast know that we do lots of political, historical topics, and we've begun 2 concurrent series, one which looks at US presidents and rates them, and one which looks at UK prime ministers and rates them. I've also had this thought that we could look at some other prominent leaders from other cultures too, just to sort of throw in a bit of a curveball.
I'm absolutely down for that. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Let's do it.
I mean, we'll keep our main sort of series going, because that's the bread and butter, as it were, of our political analysis.
This is a nice garnish for it. I mean, the Lewis and Clark thing is going to be a nice it's additional information that we're going to get to know about how the future relations with the Native Americans are going to go, what kind of things they're going to see out there, how Thomas Jefferson responds to everything that they see. I mean, it's going to be And I mean, fuck, I'd love to spend some time looking at like the Spanish Empire, like during this time, and like the Mexican army and whatnot. Like, I think that there's a lot to talk about that I'm really just like, oh yeah, there's a lot more going on, like other than just like the two main powers of the world that we see, you know. I'm stoked. Yeah, I'm down.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And as we've already spoken about Thomas Jefferson, and we've talked about the Louisiana Purchase, and so therefore, um, this topic really does follow in that particular series quite well. Yeah, so do you want to introduce a little bit about the Lewis and Clark, even though I've written somewhere Clark and Lewis, just to make things a bit original. But if you want to talk about the Lewis and Clark expedition, tell us what it is.
I did some research on it, and there was a lot that I didn't know about it. I didn't realize that it wasn't just Lewis and Clark. I don't know why, but my brain, and I guess the way that it was taught to me, made me always think that it was just Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. Um, which Sacagawea, there's a lot of different ways to pronounce her name. So like, there's gonna like I think you and I are probably gonna pronounce it differently. So there's a lot of different ways that it's been pronounced throughout like the documentaries that I watched just to get like pronunciations for her name, pronunciations for the tribe names where they came in. But that's gonna be like, oh man, I don't. I'm probably butchering it every time I say it, so I apologize deeply for that one. But um, in terms of like the beginning of Lewis and Clark's expedition, Lewis and Clark both kind of knew each other. They were in the service together during the Indian Wars, and they had kind of a relationship together, but it wasn't super like they weren't super deep. If yeah, Lewis was from Virginia. When he was 29, he was like given the proposal of like, hey, you're gonna lead this expedition. Thomas Jefferson was like, you're my personal secretary. I trust you with this job. Um, and he knew that like Lewis wasn't exactly like he had moments where he could be really rash. He needed somebody who was a little bit more methodical, a little bit different than him. So they decided that they needed to get a co-leader, and that ended up being Clark. The names, like their full names, I didn't realize were like Meriwether Lewis. What a fucking weird name. I thought that was kind of fun. And then William Clark is just kind of boring, but it's still like, I don't know. You always think of it Lewis and Clark, but they have like, that's not even their first names. Those are their last names. I think that that's such a fun little thing that I didn't know. Um, Lewis being like, the expedition had already kind of been planned out. Like Jefferson, regardless of the Louisiana Purchase, was like, I got to know what's out there. He was a very like Jefferson was a very scientific, intellectual mind. He very much wanted to have all of these questions answered. Like there had been this idea that there was a Northwest Passage, this water passage from like all the way to the east, all the way to the west, like a direct cut through the continent. And he was like, "Hey, yo, Lewis and Clark, go find that for me." Regardless of the Louisiana Purchase, and then Napoleon gets into debt. He ends up being like, I need to sell this land. He sells it off to America, and then like he's like, oh wow, this is even easier. We don't even need like it's not like he needed permission in the first place, but now he already owns the land, you know? So now he's just like, oh yeah, absolutely. Just fucking go for it, guys. And so they get together this crew of like 32 people. It's the core of Discovery. Um, and it's comprised of like traders, Frenchmen. There's a few Native Americans on there, like mixed blood Native Americans, and most importantly, in my opinion, York, who is Clark's slave, is tagged along on this adventure as well, and he is like kind of given this false promise of freedom by the end of this expedition. Like, you do this for me, by the time that you come back, it's all gonna be free. Like you're gonna be chill, it'll be all right. And like another thing that was interesting about York is that York is the only married man in this expedition. Like all of the other people are single men, Lewis and Clark included. They don't have any wives. Like the whole crew is just a bunch of single ragtag boys. and fucking York, whose wife is in the town that like Clark and him are leaving from to go meet up in St. Louis with Lewis. Like, he's leaving his wife and his child behind, and in promise of freedom. And then when they come back, like, I'll talk about what happens when they come back later, like when they come back, but it's his story alone. I was just like, wow. I spent quite a bit of time just doing reading on York alone, just because I was like, wow, wow. So yeah, so they're all meeting up in St. Louis. They get this ragtag team of boys all together, just like I said, traders, Frenchmen, just pretty much anybody that they can get their hands on who's like gonna be of use to them in this expedition. And then following the St. Louis River, they just start heading up north. And this, like right out the gate, they're met with such a horrible, like, they have these 3 boats, and like for a few days they're just pulling these boats. Like, they can't get them up the fucking river. And so like Lewis and Clark are like, all right, boys, jump out of the boat, get some rope, and just fucking pull it. And like some of you guys are gonna like push with some sticks and try to push off the bank. And like you've got 8 to 10 dudes like pulling these fucking things. Like, I just can't imagine like backbreaking work. They're just spending like in the sun. It's hot. It's gross. Like, oh my God. And York is out there being the fucking champion, and he's like leading that shit. He was the only dude who knew how to swim in the entire crew. Like, I mean, fuck, man, this guy was a champion. He like consistently throughout their expedition, like him and Sacagawea both were like, you guys are really dumb and don't know what you're doing. I'm gonna help you out. And then like every time that they tried to help out, Lewis and Clark kind of had these moments where they were like, I don't know about that. I don't know. Like, but my white man intellectual brain says otherwise. And then like they would follow along with Sacagawea or whatever York had suggested, and then they would end up being fine. Like, and so many of the circumstances where Sacagawea led them in the right direction, like she knew where they were at. She ended up getting them the help that they needed. Like, if it wasn't for her, they would have been fucked so many times. Like, it's unbelievable. I love it. It's like, you guys really didn't know what the fuck you were doing.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I went into a bit of the detail, I decided quickly, perhaps prematurely, that forget Lewis and Clark. I'm just going to focus on Sacagawea.
Yeah.
Because she strikes me as an infinitely more interesting character. And then obviously I also came across York, as you did too. I mean, I didn't locate quite as much information about York, but the few tidbits of information that I picked up upon, basically you touched upon quite a bit of it there yourself. The interesting characters, as you say, that they represented. And so I really thought to myself, do you know what? Forget Lewis and Clark. Let's call this a Sacagawea episode.
Yeah.
And I think we might do that. But what is also important to identify is, had it not been for this expedition, we wouldn't have known about Sacagawea and York.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a really, like, it's important to recognize that it is these people that are going out and doing these things, and that if it wasn't for them, like you said, like, we wouldn't have known about Sacagawea, we wouldn't have known about the things that York had done. Like, these are very important individuals. Like, regardless of Lewis and Clark being, like, they weren't super notable men, in all honesty. Like, they were the only thing that is notable about them is this expedition and the way that they were able to interact with Native Americans, because for the most part it was overwhelmingly like welcoming and calm. Like, they only had a few interactions. Like, in the research that I did, I only counted 2 interactions between 2 different tribes where things didn't go well. However, I will also make comments that in like the whole purpose of this expedition is to find what's out west, but also to, like, Jefferson's goal in this is also to create peace within all of the tribes, like the Native American tribes. He's like, everybody needs to stop being at war with each other and just start trading with America. Like, that's just what it's going to be. So Lewis and Clark, you kind of go out there, tell them that their land now belongs to, quote unquote, the great white father of the East, and to just be okay with that. And when they have like pushback, especially with the Sioux, like not too far along in their expedition, like after they get through the St. Louis River, they end up coming across the Sioux, and the Sioux are very much like not for what's about to happen. Like they're like, no, we everything over here, like we're kind of middlemen in this trading thing. Like they kind of take a small fee from traders as they go up and down the river, and like that's pretty much it. Like, I mean, they're just kind of doing their thing. And Lewis and Clark are like, yeah, no, you guys need to join in with this or it's not going to be all right. And things start to get a little bit escalated, and they like Lewis and Clark are like trying to get on their boats and go away and just start getting up the river, and like they're fucking like blunderbuss loaded and pointed at the Native Americans, and the Native Americans are bow and arrow pointed at them, and like they're rowing away in this like standoff. And their plan is to make peace with all the Native Americans, right? This is what really got me. Make peace with all the Native Americans, make no war happen. After this interaction with the Sioux, they're like, we need to get all the other Native American tribes to team up against the Sioux. God damn it, dude. Fuck you. Fuck you. Like,
Yeah,
your plan. Ugh.
you know, this old sort of maxim of divide et impera, and divide and conquer,
Yes.
comes back repeatedly throughout all of these sort of colonial powers that we have come to discuss. Let's bring it back just a little bit, because you've already started with the expedition. You're excited to get underway.
Like I feel like there's so much in the actual expedition. Like there wasn't much about Lewis and Clark's like early life that I was like, yep, this is worth talking about. Like it's mostly this expedition and like what they're gonna come across, the things that they're gonna see. The nature is like, in my opinion, is so like amazing. Like some of the paintings that they showed in one of the documentaries I watched, just like, oh, my mouth is like dropped open, and I'm just like, I remember traveling through here when I was younger, but man, I want to do it all again. Like, what an awesome adventure this must have been. Like, regardless of how horrible it was, I still feel like, wow, what a unique fucking experience to see all this land pre-development. Like, it's just so amazing. It's so cool.
Yeah. And the thing is, they only ever lost one person in the entire expedition, and that kind of makes you, obviously I'm jumping ahead now. I'm guilty of this, but it's important to make this observation at the beginning, because had the Native Americans been such an aggressive people as is often made out, there is no way on this planet that less than 50 people could have gone all the way across the country and back again.
With only one person.
Exactly. With only one fatality, that just wouldn't have happened. So therefore we do kind of have to put that logical observation into context. And Jefferson, go on.
The guy who died his name was Charles Floyd, and he died of appendicitis. Like, he didn't die of anything that they could have done anything about in this time period. Like, his
very
death
early
was,
on, as in before the expedition even really started, wasn't it? So
it was like a few days in, they were doing the pulling and getting through the river, and like a few days after that, he perished. Like, it was something that they just couldn't help. Like, and throughout this entire expedition, he's the only dude who dies. I mean, they travel for 2.5 years, 7,000 miles. Like, one death, fucking incredible. Like, that was something that I took note of, and I was just like, wow. That I didn't know that. That's fucking insane. Like, it's definitely worth noting. Absolutely.
Yeah. So Jefferson wrote the brief as follows: the object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River and such principal stream of it as, by its course and communication with the waters of the Pacific Ocean, whether the Columbia, Oregon, Colorado, or any other river may offer the most direct and practicable water communication across this continent for the purpose of commerce. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
From everything that I've read, so they had two primary missions, as it were. Establishing an American presence on the territory before European powers came in to lay a claim, because even though they had made this purchase, that doesn't mean to say that other powers wouldn't come in and try to sort of, what would you say, rain on their parade, as it were.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
mean, at this point, they already kind of have like fur traders and have already penetrated through the Louisiana Purchase, and they're already making their way through. Like, I mean, we'll come across, once again, just because I'm so stoked, we'll come across a tribe later on when they get to the West Coast that already knows like English trading, and they are very stuck up in their trading, and they're like, you can't get anything past us. We already fucking know all this shit, motherfuckers. And like everybody else like that they come across, all the other tribes are way more relaxed, and like they haven't, like they're kind of just doing the commerce because they need to, and these other tribes that they come across have already encountered them. So it shows that yes, people have already been making their way here. They've already done this. Like Lewis and Clark are just like the first more formal expedition under the president's direct orders, you know. It's like, yeah, I don't know. It was interesting to think about all the other individuals who may have already done this that are just completely lost to history, you know? It's wild.
Yeah. And indeed, I've made a subnote. So it's not just other European powers, but also they part to emphasize American, as in the white man, American domination over the indigenous peoples within the area. So obviously, this expedition is not there to establish dominion over these people, because clearly they are not capable of doing so.
Yeah.
However, it really struck me later on that it could be said this expedition is also a bit of a reconnaissance mission. You know, go out there, find out who's who, find out who's a bit more aggressive than who else.
Yeah.
What kind of numbers are we talking about? What kind of tactics and strategies? What weaknesses do they have? Because if
Yep.
I'm not mistaken, these are also military men. So therefore, they are capable of making those kinds of sort of intelligent guesses, observations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And, you know, that kind of, that strikes me as being a bit underhanded. But then again, that's the time that they lived in.
Yeah.
And obviously, the second part was to analyze and investigate natural resources within the territory, and of course, to establish trading relations with the indigenous tribes. But I think that was the secondary, very much
Yeah.
secondary.
That definitely felt like more of a secondary objective, a like kind of a like a guise, I guess. Like it's much more of like a I would imagine that Jefferson would have put that at the forefront in being like, this is the main objective. But then like on the side kind of being like, hey yo, Lewis and Clark. Also though, I need you to let me know, can we fuck them up? And that's pretty much exactly what they do. I mean, when they come back, they're taking notes of like all the tribes, the resources that they have, the ways that they go about combat. I mean, the different tribes that are more likely to go to war. I mean, during the winters that they spend with tribes, because they do it a couple of times, they learn about the cultures of the tribes, and they learn how different and how like drastically the culture is so different between so many of these tribes. Like, I mean, when they get to the West Coast, they're going to notice that the way that the Native Americans speak over there is completely different. They don't ride horses, they ride on canoes. Like, they are going, like, they take notes of all this shit because it's important to know, because Jefferson is going to be like, yeah, no, we need to get out there, we need to like, start getting into this. And I mean, it's going to happen so rapidly. I mean, we'll even get to talk about it by the end of this episode, how rapidly it happens. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable.
Yeah, it strikes me as horrific in many ways, abhorrent, the fact that this tactic, it's not unprecedented. Um, Cultures have done this. They send out these kind of scouts, these nice people, the ones who seem,
Missionaries is
yeah,
is one of the words that I put down, was like they feel like missionaries. They're coming out and they're like, we've got these great things if you join us, kind of thing. And if you don't, you're going to hell. Like,
yeah, yeah. These are sort of
it's,
unobtrusive types, aren't they, generally
yeah,
speaking? But then what follows is the part which I find extremely distasteful. So it's the same thing that happened over in India, in Afghanistan with the British, and it's happened here. These people have an opportunity with new cultures to establish relations. There was never a need to be uh, to go to war, to shed blood. Establish relations. You know,
mm,
create the possibility of cooperation and working with them. Why do you go in there straight away to deceive them and then to screw them? Yeah, it's
yeah,
what the Brits did in India and in Afghanistan. It's what Jefferson's government did with the indigenous peoples of America. There wasn't that
absolutely.
need. Why do it? And I hate the fact that history keeps on throwing these episodes at us, um, and it does get frustrating because it never need to happen.
Yeah, it's disheartening because just as you said, like it's under this guise of like cooperation that this could happen. And we know that the intention all along is, and the way that the indigenous people are seen is as these savages, as these like crazy people who don't understand the white man's culture and they don't understand like technology. Like, it's not that they don't understand technology, it's that you don't understand their culture. Like, you're not willing to accommodate to their culture the things that they do. And because of that, they see it as, if they're not going to change, we have to force them to change. And like we'll see later on with like the schools that indigenous people are forced to go to, that like whiteify them is the term that I'm going to use, because it's just, that's exactly what they do. Like, they it's horrifying, and none of this needed to happen in the first place. Like you said, like this was such a unnecessary move, like especially considering the relations that Lewis and Clark and the Corps of Discovery had with Native American peoples. They did have pretty good relations. They were able to trade, they understood the cultures, they communicated, like they tried to understand them. And if I feel as though things could have been different if Lewis and Clark were like doing this more on their own volition, and it was more of just like we're gonna go out with this crew of people, less under this guise of like figuring all this shit out for Jefferson. I don't know, Jefferson would have found anybody else. You know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to think that maybe this wouldn't have happened, but no, Jefferson would have found literally anybody else to do it. You know, like, and it would have happened no matter what. Like, the people, period, were already doing this. This is just a formal expedition. Like, people are already coming across the Native Americans moving out west. So, like, this was gonna happen regardless. The violence and the formality in which the violence occurred, because it was so much the United States government that took part in this violence and this pushing of the Native Americans out. Like, I don't think that step ever needed to happen. Like, it could have much more been just like traders being like, all right, we're going to live out here as well. And now there's going to be more commerce between us and the Native Americans because we also live here and you also live here as well. Like, and more of an understanding of the cultures. And I think it would have been so much more amazing to see the joining of those cultures rather than the complete separation and push out of this culture that is now basically like, we don't know much about like we still know stuff about the Native Americans, but it's so much less than we could have known if we didn't slaughter so many of them. You know, like, so much of their tradition and their storytelling is oral communication. And once you kill off the people who can tell those stories, there are no more stories to tell. And I can't help but imagine that that was also part of the plan, was like, well, we know that they don't write shit down. Like, fuck it. If we kill all of them, nobody's even going to know. Like, I can't help but feel as though Jefferson or like later presidents had thoughts of those, like, we could do this, because that's happened so often, like throughout history, people have constantly done shit like this. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was somebody like Jefferson had this on his mind as well.
It's definitely a Christian tactic. This is one which essentially oversaw the spread of Christianity throughout much of pagan Europe, because they were able to apply the written word, from which they were able to then enshrine the importance of their own scholars within areas of power by sending information out which they could rely upon, and so on. So yeah, I think that there was a certain advantage which they used, unfortunately unfairly, as a result of their own ignorance of these other cultures.
Yeah.
And they took advantage of the fact that other cultures didn't have those ways, or had never felt the need to adopt those ways. Storytelling was far more art related, drawn, as it were, than it was written down. You reminded me, when talking about the choice, I came across in my research Jefferson's reference to his choice of Lewis. And he said it was impossible to find a character who, to a complete science in botany, natural history, mineralogy, and astronomy, joined the firmness of constitution and character, prudence, habits adapted to the woods, and a familiarity with the Indian manners and character requisite for this undertaking. All the latter qualifications Captain Lewis has. And indeed, he also sent Lewis, in preparation for the expedition, to Philadelphia to study stuff under Benjamin Rush, a physician, then Andrew Ellicott, an astronomer, and so on. So, as in, there was a lot of preparation for this expedition. We're not going to go into it too much, but as in, there was also a lot of political bargaining that he had to speak with. I think it was it the Federalists, and so there was quite a bit involved. But yeah, we've jumped into the start. However, because there's another episode that kind of takes place contemporaneously in some ways. So Sacagawea, born 1788. There's no specific thing about that date. It's also interesting, though, because when I was looking at her, when she died, on the one hand it says 1812 in December, on the other hand it says 1884. Yes. So she either died at the age of 24 or 95, which is mad, isn't it?
I did some reading into that, and I finding out, because there was a similar story with York, that York either died young or he died really old. And the same thing with Sacagawea when I was doing my research of these are two very different, I mean, fuck, dude, not in your 90s and in your 20s, one or the other. It's fuck. But there were beliefs that the most common, and the 24 age is what is believed to be what really happened, that she died of typhoid. Just she went back to a tribe and ended up contracting typhoid, and she just died. And then the other one is that she went back to her tribe and then she went back to she went with the original tribe that she was with, which I can't remember the name of, and then she went back to her brother's tribe and ended up living with them, and then she just kind of vanished off the face of the earth. And so it's one or the other. She either died of typhoid or she lived happily ever after. It's up to you to decide, because this is history. It's just weird. I was like, what the fuck? This is bizarre, dude. These are two very different things, And I mean, there was no written evidence that of the second, of the latter, that she did make it to the 90s. There was no evidence that that ever happened. So, but there was lots of written evidence that she did die of typhoid in her 20s. So, I would bet that the 20s thing is probably the one to go with. Yeah.
Okay, so a bit of background into her. She was sold to a Quebecois trapper called Toussaint Charbonneau at the age of 13. He apparently at the same time also bought another Shoshone girl. Shoshone was the tribe, as his wife. She was known as Otter Woman. And when he went on, so because he was invited to participate in the expedition, and at this time, Sacagawea was also his wife, and she actually had a child, which they called Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, and within 2 months, she basically put this kid on her back and went along with her Quebecois trapper
Yeah.
husband, and basically traipsed across the southern United States from one side
No
to the other and back
kidding.
again.
No
Yeah,
kidding. She just
crazy
fucking
stuff,
like
huh?
yeah, and I mean even earlier on, like she's kidnapped as a child. Like that's her very beginning is like she's kidnapped as a young child along with several other members of her tribe at the time, and that's why she's separated and like she's sold off. And like I mean Lewis and Clark even say like that one of the main reasons why they hire her husband is for Sacagawea. Like they were like, she knows the languages of the places that we're going to go to. She knows the land of the place that we got to go to. Like, she is an invaluable resource to us. We need to hire this guy. And regardless of the fact that she's just like she just had this fucking child, like she does carry this kid across America and back on her fucking back. Like all the pictures of her, like all the paintings, like she's got this like thing on her back. And like when I was younger, I always like wondered what that was. And like that's her fucking kid, dude. Like she's got a child strapped on there. She's like, holy shit, dude. Just like, oh my god, I couldn't imagine. And just like in the ways that like Lewis and Clark kind of treat her along the expedition as well, like there were a few points where I was just like, you guys suck. Like I hate you guys. Like they meet a native tribe who's got like this one gentleman's got this really nice otter coat, and Lewis and Clark are like, hey, take your belt off. Give us those beads. And they fucking trade Sacagawea's belt of blue beads for the fucking coat just because they were like, we want to give this to Thomas Jefferson. We think that this would be a great gift. And I'm just like, you guys suck, dude. Fuck you. Fuck you.
It is amazing the amount of things that had to be essentially given up by Sacagawea and York,
Yeah.
to help these people with their expedition. At least in the case of Sacagawea, there was some kind of recompense, but we'll come to that later on. Yeah, we
Mm.
these people are so great, and talking about it, we both sort of recall certain things that we've learned about them, and it's like, oh
Yeah.
wow, it's almost like I knew them. Do you remember when she
Yeah.
took off the belt and
It's like reminiscing about like old memories. You're just like,
yeah,
oh
yeah.
my gosh, you remember? Yeah. I'm just like, fuck, dude, and like all these little other things. But yeah, Sacagawea is just fuck, man. What a incredible character. What an incredible person. Like, if it wasn't for her, fucking Lewis and Clark would not have made it. Period. Like, I just, I don't think that it would have fucking happened. Like, she knew where they were going from the like vast majority of the time. Like, she was like, yep, I got an idea. Like, trust me. And they were like, I guess. It's just like, fuck you guys. Just fucking, you asked for this help, Like, just take it, Fucking frustrating.
Yeah, absolutely. And this sense of, we know better than you, but okay, we'll follow you. It's
Yeah.
almost like begrudging her
Yeah.
superior knowledge in some ways. It's
It's frustrating.
yeah. Clark, you also mentioned some of the topic. I mean, Clark was not very nice, I think, to York, but he was nice with his, I suppose, reporting of Sacagawea than Lewis was. I hope I haven't got that the wrong way around. But
I
in
agree that I had
yeah,
moments where I was like, "Fuck!" I think I've like flip flopped the names. So you're all good there.
mm,
I think it'll happen as well.
okay, but I mean, he notes in his journal at the beginning. So a Frenchman named Chabon, he calls him Chabona, but it's obviously, that's not the name. It's
Yeah.
Charbonneau. Um, I get the feeling Clark and Lewis were not the best authors because there are quite a few interpretations which are sort of made with regards to their writing.
Yes.
Who speaks the big belly language, visit us. He wished to hire and informed us his two squaws, he's written, but this is squaw, so this is a reference to a female Native American, were snake Indians. We engao, which is engaged, him to go on with us and take one of his wives to interpret the snake language. So this is essentially the note which references them, Lewis and Clark, engaging Charbonneau and
Yeah.
Sacagawea.
It's it's exciting. I won't lie about it. It's exciting. Like I think I mean, Lewis and Clark in my mind, had hit some really tough patches right at the gate. And from the time that they hire Sacagawea and her husband, things don't get a whole lot better, but they do get substantially like less bad in terms of like being able to communicate with the other natives that they come across. Um, they're able to trade and barter better. Like Sacagawea is able to find them food in moments where they're starving because like I mean fuck dude, she knows the land better than anybody else who's in the expedition. I mean, while Lewis is this incredible botanist and who does have the scientific mind for nature, he doesn't quite like all this shit is new to them. Like from the west onward, like they thought that there could be dinosaurs that were still alive walking in the center of this continent. Like they had no fucking idea what they were going to come across. And so I mean anything's free game, you know? And so they really are lost in terms of just we got no fucking idea what's going to be here. And Sacagawea has lived in these regions for her whole life and she knows what to do. And like with her help, she ends up getting them to their fucking destination. Like they come across literally multiple forks in the river, and she's like, this one, and like they're like, okay, like reluctantly, all right, and they end up getting there. Like it's unbelievable. She is their fucking savior through most of this. Like, and especially like the idea like one of the documentaries I watched, they had mentioned that the vision of Sacagawea as well was such an important thing for Lewis and Clark's mission in terms of just being a symbol of peace. Like literally babe in arms coming up to these tribes. Like, are you really gonna kill a lady with her baby in her arms kind of thing? Like as opposed to here's 33 large men rolling up to your tribe and they're gonna be like, this is our land also, and meh, that's your problem. Like it's sending a different message now. It's sending a different message for the tribes that they're going to come across, and I think that that's a really interesting. I thought that was an interesting point of view and an interesting way to look at that.
Well, I think what it reflects is the fact that these Native American cultures were so vastly different to what the Americans of those days had seen before. They would not have been dissuaded by the arrival of a woman with a baby.
Yeah,
If anything, they'd have probably taken the woman and the baby and raped the woman and killed all the men. But
yeah,
Native Americans obviously saw things very differently. They had a different culture and they associated certain levels of importance to that. And so thought, yeah, these people are not likely to be a warring tribe. They're here,
Yeah.
as you said, peacefully, and we shall approach them in a, it's okay, with a bit of suspicion, but we're not going to just all out attack them.
Yeah. And I think as well, like during the time that they interact with these tribes as well, like York is of great fascination to the Native Americans. Like he he is very dark skinned. Like compared to a lot of other like black slaves during this time, he is extremely dark toned, and Native Americans had never seen a black person to this degree, like so dark. And one of the original recollections that, like, I think either Lewis or Clark wrote this down was that a Native American, like, licked his fingers and rubbed York's chest to try to get, like, to see if he was dirty or something. And, like, they were like, whoa. And the response, this was fucking weird. This was so weird, which is why I have to talk about it. The Native American people saw York as a powerful figure because he resembled a bear. And the Native American people saw the bear as this powerful symbol. And so they like saw this giant, like he was like 200 plus pounds. He's like over 6 foot. He's a big fucking dude. The Native Americans are like fascinated with him, and the husbands of the Native American women are like encouraging their wives to have sex with York in order to hopefully have the weird like transference of their power into their offspring. Fucking weird, dude. I like sat there and I like was like, what the fuck is going on? Like, and all the journal stuff too, like Lewis and Clark both mention how often like they're like, yeah, no, this would be such a disgraceful thing for like us if like we saw our wives having sex with like a native person, like somebody random just coming into their village and just being like, hey, and now they're just having sex. But like the husbands were encouraging of this because they saw it as like with the whole core of Discovery, they were like, if we can get you guys to do this, we will have better trade. And the women were like, in most of the research that I did, the women were actually pretty okay with this. Like they also saw it as what like sex wasn't as like a disgraceful thing. It was a much more open type of thing that the Native Americans had a very different culture and understanding of. And I just thought that that was wild. Like the women saw it as like if they had sex with Lewis and Clark, they also possessed the things that Lewis and Clark had. And I was just like, this is crazy shit, dude. And like the whole time they're like taking advantage of that. Like Lewis and Clark crew is taking advantage of these women, just like being like, yes, if this is what it's going to take to have like the best trade, we'll do it. And like the husbands are also like,
sacrificing themselves, eh?
yeah, and like the husbands are also like, yeah, 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 do this, go for it. Like what a fuck, this is wild shit, man. This was like the culture difference is unbelievable. And like I loved like the weird little journal bits of like Lewis and Clark just being like, if our wives were doing, like if we had wives and if this was happening out east, this would be such a crazy thing. But for these Native Americans, it's just fine, it's chill, it's whatever, it's not disgraceful. And I was just like, this is wowza. You guys feel like maybe you're just like super blindsided at something right now. Like you're just like, we're just gonna turn our eyes against this thing. Like if the women feel as though they must sacrifice their own bodies in order to get better trade, I feel like you're probably kind of like turning a blind eye to that if you're just being so accepting of it, you know? Like I don't know, there's a lot going on there that I was just like, I don't know how to feel about this, you know? Like I'm so conflicted because like this feels wrong, this feels gross. But the research that I was doing, like the women seemed okay with it. And like in this consensual way, and I was just like, is it really consensual? I don't know. I don't know. it seemed weird, man. That's why I was like, this is weird. This is so weird.
Yeah, this is why, I mean, we have to really emphasize the fact we represent a certain type of culture which is perhaps in some ways very restrictive with regards to the way it identifies certain relations with sexuality.
Yeah,
It has a very limited sense of spirituality outside of religious doctrine. There
yeah,
isn't really much leniency with the way that we kind of identify things. We're also very much based upon possession, possessiveness. You know, this is mine, she's mine, he's mine, they're mine.
yeah,
Um, and in at least it would seem in this case, you know, the spirit cannot actually be possessed of another person. Um, and if a culture of a certain group is such, then that is their culture.
yeah,
And yet we see it through the eyes that we have always experienced,
yeah,
our lives, our society. They would probably, and I'm saying they, and this, it's extremely, but the people who, the tribes people who perhaps were engaging in this, if they were to have visited a white Western city and noticed how people limited themselves to living in concrete homes,
yeah,
and they only ever really interacted with fixed groups of individuals. They didn't let really strangers into their homes uninvited,
yeah,
and that in many cases the women folk were not allowed to, you know, do whatever they wanted. They
yeah,
would probably have said, you are imprisoning these spirits. That's not the natural way.
yeah,
Um, and I can empathize with that.
yeah. It's a very different like cultural mindset to shift towards because like especially like still today, sex and relationships between two people is such a taboo subject to talk about. Like it's like I don't know, it's not something that people really feel comfortable talking about in an open environment, just like casually. Um, and there are multiple cultures today that do openly talk about sex and have very different approaches than, in my case, than America does. Um, and I think that it is very much that closed perspective of just like, I'm not like to try to understand these cultures better and just be like, this is their culture, understand it for what it is, like that's it. Like, and I mean throughout a lot of the research of the tribes, just like the level at which the respect for women was so much higher, the position that women had in tribes was so much higher. Like it I mean Lewis and Clark later on are going to come across a tribe on the west coast where the women are primarily the leaders, and that's going to be kind of a shocking thing for them because they're going to be like, the fuck is we got to get out of here. This is weird. Like, and that's part of the reason why they do end up being like, we got to leave is because, like, I mean, it's not directly because the women are in charge, but it is because the tribe there is so culturally different and because, like, they're very stuck up in their, like, trading and their bartering because they've already come across a bunch of other people who are, like, being assholes in terms of trading. So, of course, they're going to be a little bit more stuck up. It makes sense to me. Um, but it was such a weird thing to imagine like these sexual relations in order to benefit from barter and trade like it makes sense if you have this different culture that does do this already, and has a different approach to sexual relationships and has a different approach to just these interactions between individuals. It's a very perhaps I'm still so like culture shocked at it because I do live in such a enclosed circle of like sex isn't something that gets talked about often, um, and I've been trying to be in more friend groups that openly talk about things like this and try to get outside of my comfort zone just because it is something that's important in order to understand these cultures and to not feel like this weird level of like I feel uncomfortable about this and I'm just not quite sure why. Like it's weird, and I don't really like that feeling. And so it's good to like have a pinpoint of like that's why. Okay, I understand that, and that makes me feel like I just something to work on. Just like be more understanding. Me.
Yeah, and I mean, by reading this material, we do get to experience some of these alternative, not only cultures, but also the times, the moments in history in which these cultures interchanged with a culture which we are more familiar with. I'm not sure which one of these cultures I would necessarily prefer to interact with.
Yeah,
And as much as it's possible to say, oh, but the Americans were sort of European stock, and so therefore, of a morality which I would perhaps be more familiar with. That may be so, but I have to say, I find the Native American association with nature, the world which surrounds them, the spiritual element to be infinitely more interesting. And
absolutely.
definitely one which I would love to sort of identify more of. And perhaps if we can, finally find somebody who is of this
Yeah,
sort of origin, then I'd love to find out more. So if you can find
yeah,
that'd be cool.
yeah. I've still got my eyes out, and I will let you know as soon as I get something because I'm super interested in this.
Cool.
Just because it's like I don't know, it's important to get those points of view. I mean, you and I are the like not to be like this, but you and I are the colonizers, and like we are the people who represent like I'm an American, you're a British person. We do represent these countries that are like have done some fucking insane shit. And so it's super important that we do get these perspectives from people who have been impacted by our ancestors and the things that like our country has done to them. Um, I mean, I'm regardless of like I don't believe that my ancestors directly took part in those things, but it's still super important to recognize that my country, my nation that I am a part of has fucked you over so bad to a point where your story isn't told. I want that story to be told, like it needs to be told because it's not told enough. Like so much of the research was just like a bunch of white dudes being like, yeah, 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 and like one Native American woman being like, well, actually, it was a lot more like this. And I was like, I appreciate you, ma'am. Like, thank you for making this a way more enjoyable, like, documentary to watch because it felt like she was giving real information and a bunch of these other dudes were just like, Lewis and Clark, Lewis and Clark. And she was like, Sacagawea actually was like, and then she talked about York as well. Like, she was the one who mentioned the people who, like, whose stories I felt as though the other members were not representing or talking about.
Yeah, it's actually a good point, because I mean, I don't know how much of more detail we're going to go into because we're already pushing on to past an hour,
I
Aiden.
know,
Yes,
I'm
so
like, what
there's
the heck is going on?
yeah, I know. But I mean, maybe we could just throw in a few more tidbits of information and perhaps we can tie it up. But
Yeah.
if you go directly to read some information on the Lewis and Clark expedition, you're not automatically going to be introduced to a lot of information about Sacagawea.
Hmm.
However, if you go and do some research on Sacagawea, you do get lots and lots about Lewis and Clark. And that also kind of tells you really about the cultural bias which still exists to this day. Um, one of and I will sort of hand over to get a bit more information from you directly about the journey and so on. But I think we'll obviously going to have to cut out a lot. But
Yeah.
um, not a lot was known about this expedition for a long time after the expedition took place. Now, that kind of stinks to me of two things. First of all, it's a bit like maybe the government wanted to keep it a secret, so they didn't want other powers to be aware of the details of what was identified. Um, and on the other hand, it was simply a question of, well, let's file this away, and because we want to do what we want to do anyway, and we'll just use it as a point of reference. So for the next 100 years, more or less, after the expedition, nobody even knows who Lewis and Clark are. As in, these characters are forgotten. It's
Yeah.
only after the centenary that some awareness is reintroduced into the U.S. population, and then thereafter another 50 or 60 years before, oh wow, look at this, and then we're already more or less into the good portion of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And then it's in the 2000s when the two journals are brought together and there is some proper investigative journalism, as it were, proper research and building of a story, which is what
Yeah.
we have sort of now become aware of. That's quite crazy too, isn't it? How these is treated has been treated by history, I should say.
It's a like I mean, Lewis and Clark in the Corps of Discovery being gone for 2.5 years, most of the country thought that they died. Um, like by the time that they come back, most people had thought that they already perished along the journey and that they just weren't coming back. And so, like, they get back, and this is very much down the line for their journey. But I guess it'll make it so that way we don't have to talk about it later. Um, so on their trip back, they're seeing traders and like fur trappers going through the rivers, like the places that they just spent all this time traversing where they hadn't seen anybody for months on end. They're seeing trappers and traders coming through, and they're just fucking doo-doo-doo, doo-doo-doo. They're like fucking full go, man. Like in like Thomas Jefferson said that he couldn't imagine this taking more than like he was like it would take 50 generations to fill up the amount of land that we have discovered here. And it took America like 5 decades to fill it out. Like very little time, like 50 years, and we were like, boom. As soon as we found out that there was more land and more things out there, Americans were fucking going at it, and they were going at it fast. And like by the time that Lewis and Clark get back, it is easily forgotten because everybody else is already on the way out. They're already going. They already know that there's more out there. Like, I mean, there is this welcoming party that comes for them in St. Louis when they get back, and like Lewis ends up being appointed as governor of the Louisiana Territory by Jefferson as like a reward. And he's told like all the shit that you like, all the journals, all the research that you did, I need you to compile all this information for me and give me like a report about all this, like hundreds upon hundreds of documents, journals, maps, all of this. And Lewis is like extremely overwhelmed, and he ends up fucking killing himself. He shoots himself in the head and in the chest on his way to Washington D.C. in order to like he's like going to D.C. in order to be like, I can't do this anymore. Like my health is suffering because of this. And on his way, he's at like a roadside inn, and his slave comes in after hearing a couple of gunshots, and he's got a bullet wound in his head and a bullet wound in his chest, and he's bleeding out on the floor. And like I'm not gonna lie, I think that that is also another reason why the like a lot of the shit that with the expedition, why we don't see a lot of it is because Lewis was in charge of compiling it, and he killed himself. Like he didn't end up writing a single word of the things that Jefferson asked for after like 6 years. Like he didn't do any of it. He couldn't. Like he wanted to go back out into the wilderness and just go do his own thing like Clark did. I mean, Clark got some land, and he just like I mean, I don't think that was Clark. I think that was another like high-end general that was like involved in the Corps, but like all these other members were compensated with like pensions and large plots of land, like hundreds of acres, and like he's given this political duty that he is not ready for whatsoever. Like he had just spent 2.5 years exploring all this land, and then you're like, all right, get into it, buddy. Like, fuck, man, I can't imagine how difficult that must have been for him as an individual. Like, god damn, dude, fuck. And so I do imagine that must have played a huge role in terms of like why we don't see a lot of this is because of that circumstance, you know?
Mm. I find it interesting that somebody would shoot themselves as suicide twice, once in the head, once in the chest. That kind of speaks to me as the possibility of some other uh, person's intervention. But
I also agree with that because I thought that it was rather interesting, but all of the firsthand accounts of the incident showed like that his slave wasn't around, like there weren't really anybody, like there wasn't really anybody who would have a reason to go after him in that sort of way aside from his slave, but like his slave was the guy who came in and like found him dead on the ground, you know? So I don't know. It's a weird situation, but I can't imagine why you would do that other than to like be like a surefire way. You know, like in case something fucks up here, at least I know that I'm gonna die. Like, I mean, if you fucking got one to the head and one to the chest, if one of these doesn't work, if you can't stop a bullet to the heart, you can't stop a bullet to the head. Like, not
yeah,
to be
but
like super morbid.
yeah, but I mean that's the problem though, isn't it, with the story? Because you only need one. I mean,
You
if somebody's
should.
been shot in the head, they're not going to then thereafter shoot themselves in the chest as well, and vice
Yeah.
versa. I imagine. I don't know. Um,
Yeah, I
yeah.
I all the stuff that I said was that it everything pointed to a suicide. It was not a murder, but the bullet wound to the chest and the bullet wound to the head, I was still like I was definitely like this is
Mm.
huh. But yeah, I'm just trying to think like if I was in a situation like that, if I was so desperate that I was just like I can't do this, like I don't know. I'd want to make sure that it works, I guess. Like that's super morbid and super fucked up to say out loud, but like it's I feel like if you're in such a point of desperation, you could get yourself into those points, and I could see it happening for him. I mean, it does
Mm.
happen for him.
Mm.
Like, scary.
So we haven't covered the details of the actual trip as well, nor have we covered some of the tribes with whom they met. I think we should go into some of
Yeah,
these elements as well. Um,
absolutely.
Time is an issue. Do you want to talk
Yeah.
about talk about the tribes at least?
Uh,
The other scientific elements that they've natural history and natural biology stuff we can forget about, but the
we
tribes,
can
go for it.
skip that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So post meeting Sacagawea, they are going through these tribes, um, and luckily they end up coming across Sacagawea's old tribe that she was kidnapped from, and like just coming across a war band, and the war band ends up being her brother as the leader of the war band, which is just like extreme luck. Um, and upon coming across this tribe in particular, they end up trading for horses, and they can now traverse the Rocky Mountains. Just like the horses are more of like a pack mule type situation, just throwing on goods that they're traveling with. Um, they make it across the Rocky Mountains after like 8 days of just horrible weather. The Native American group that they traded the horses with was like, hey, there's this path through the mountains that's going to take 5 days, but it's going to be really low on like game food that you can eat. So that's what we got for you. And so they go up through those mountains. It takes them 8 days. They like end up eating um, like hacks. They end up eating their horses, like some of their horses, and they make it through the mountains. Sacagawea ends up like finding another tribe, and they end up coming across them. And by this point, they're very much on the way. Like they are dead set on just getting to the ocean, and they do. This is very much like a blast through it. But they build some canoes, they take the Columbia River, and they end up making it like at one point Lewis actually says that they make it to the ocean. They're seeing the Great Pacific and they're sailing on it right now in their canoes. But it was actually just that the Columbia River gets so wide that it just looks like the ocean and that they hadn't even reached it yet. And so they finally reached the northern coast of Oregon, southern Washington now. And they're like, "Ka-chow! We made it! Look at this! We made it! fuck, it's wintertime, we gotta settle down. And so they build a fort on, like, in this really mossy, foggy area. There's another tribe there, and they are just, the culture difference is so drastic that they're significantly shocked at what it's like. Like, the people speak a different language. It's said that they spoke like chickens, like clucking of chickens, was a description of the way that their language was spoken. They sat like frogs. They used canoes instead of horses. They like farmed the sea instead of the land. Like, this was a very different culture and a very different group that Lewis and Clark came across, and it was very much this like culture shock for them. Of They come back and they reach their goal and they're like, wait a second, these are not the same. Like, they were expecting the Native Americans to be the exact same throughout all of the America, like all of America. And that's not the case. Like, all these tribes are so drastically different. They do, based off of the location where they are, they accommodate to the land around them, and like they don't do like what America does in terms of just like, give it to me, tell me everything you know, and now I'm going to utilize all this and just kind of like also at the same time brush it off because I don't really care. I've got this one goal in mind. Like, the Native Americans are utilizing nature and they're respecting the nature around them. Like, they move with the food and they go where the food goes. And so, like, these are very different cultures that they're just not used to, and the females are the primary leaders of this particular tribe on the West Coast that they come across. And so, like, this is very different for them. And so they end up trying to leave a little bit early. They're met with a bunch of snow, and it goes horribly, and they end up coming back to the fort that they built and trying again a few weeks later, and they end up getting through. And this is like 4 or 5 months post, just with their fort on the West Coast. And then they leave and then go back to St. Louis. And just like the culture differences between the tribes that they interact with, on their way back, they have this interaction with the Blackfoot tribe. And this is their only like confrontation that they have. One of like the Blackfoot warriors are trying to like take the Lewis and Clark's guns and horses, and Lewis and Clark aren't having it. And so one of the members gets heated and shoots, like, I guess one of the Corps of Discovery members ends up stabbing one of the Blackfoot warriors, and then another member of the Corps shoots another member, and they just kind of disperse. Like, nobody on the Corps of Discovery's end dies. It is like it freaks them out, and they just kind of flee away. But with the bodies of the two native tribesmen that they killed, they put them in a peace medal around their neck, as like a sign that this is the future, is what it feels like. Of like, they lay them to rest with bows and arrows, and then around their neck the American symbol of peace, like the medal of peace. And to any Native American who would come across this is, as this person in the documentary described, this is a calling card for America at this point. Like, it's a sign that this is the future. This is what's going to happen if you don't cooperate. And it's exactly like, it's what's going to happen. But it feels like such a weird, fucked up thing to be like, you died and here's the medal of peace, like, because we were the ones who got angry and we shot at you. Like, it's such a weird thing. And this is like their only negative interaction that they really have with the Native American tribes during their like entire expedition of 2.5 years. It's fucking incredible that nothing else happened, but at the same time, this is such a weird interaction that it's like, this is what's going to happen from here on out. Like, past this moment is like bloodshed Trail of Tears. Everybody's going to be getting themselves pushed out of here. Um, and yeah, it's just painful.
Yeah, this is something that this is a topic which we're going to talk about as we also go through other presidents that follow, because this is a very much a concurrent episode or chapter, as it were, many chapters in the development of the country. Just also quickly to refer back to York, as you said, he kind of had this feeling that he would be released upon the termination of the expedition. Clark, however, refused repeatedly, even though, as you also said, all of the other explorers, they were rewarded, they got double pay, they got land. York got nothing. In fact, Clark whipped York and put him in jail.
Yep.
And thereafter, it's, as you said, there are different rumors as to what happened, whether or not he died younger or older. That particular point we can leave to the discussion for other historians.
I will tell you my favorite if I can, though.
Go for it.
Because I do have a favorite.
Yeah, please. But just to say that it's important to stress this point. As you said, York was a hugely important figure for this entire expedition for a number of different reasons, for the help that he gave, for the impression that he left upon the indigenous peoples who had never seen a black man of his like before, and yet for his rewards to essentially be a whipping and to be thrown into jail. I'm lost for words, really, and I think people listening to that, or who were not aware of it, or people who were aware of it and would like to reflect upon it, would perhaps have a better choice of words than I would. Yes, please tell me your. Well, let's conclude with the York story then. So your favorite.
I'll finish up with York, with his possible ending. That is my favorite one that I read, was that he goes back to Louisville and he becomes like a cab rider, like on the horse and wagon kind of deal, because that's where his wife is, and his wife has since moved, and like because she is also a slave, she's been moved to a different state, and he is like, well, this sucks. So he ends up running away and joins one of the tribes that he came across with Lewis and Clark, and joins them. He ends up becoming a quite prominent member in the tribe as well. There was a French fur trader who ended up coming across this very, matching the description of York, the man claimed that he traveled with Lewis and Clark years before, years prior. He had already come through this land. He knew the people. And this Frenchman took note of it. He wrote it down multiple times because he came across York multiple times. He went out west, and on his journey west, he came across this tribe, and he came across this very large black man who claimed that he traveled with Lewis and Clark to the west years prior, and that he had an understanding for the culture, and that this is where he ended up. And then the Frenchman came back, and he came across the same guy, and he was just more conversation, very friendly man, matches the description of York himself. And it said that he lived until he was in his 70s or 80s. But there's just not much known about it. But I personally love that story, and I hope that that's what happens for York, because especially he was, during the expedition, he's experiencing freedoms for the first time. He's going out hunting. He's a fantastic marksman. He gets to barter and trade with the Native Americans by himself. He is going on scouting parties, and then to come back and be forced back into slavery. Of course he would be adamantly being telling Clark, I thought that I would get freedom from this. And
he was even allowed to participate in a vote during the expedition. Which kind of makes you feel as though he's being respected more, right?
Yeah, there wasn't a lot in the stories about York that really showed that he was a member that was seen like lesser than any other member of the Corps of Discovery, aside from the ways that Lewis and Clark talk about him in their journals. Like, aside from that, every member of the Corps of Discovery was an important member, and that includes Sacagawea and York. Like, they were huge figures for them. I mean, like, York was the only member who could swim. He knew how to use a rifle, which was weird because he shouldn't have known how to use a rifle as a slave, but he was an incredible marksman. Like, he killed an elk for the fucking crew at one point, and they ate it. Like, he'd never seen an elk. He took notes of all the different species of animals and different things that he saw. Like, he was a core member of this crew, and he doesn't get any compensation. He doesn't get any rewards for it. He is completely like sided off, and Clark punishes him for it. And that's why I really deeply hope that his ending is that he ends up like running away, getting freedom with a Native American tribe, and becoming like a leader in that tribe, because everything that was said in the documents that talked about what could be York in this tribe was that he was a very highly respected member of the tribe, like possibly even the leader of the tribe at this point. Like, great man. I really fucking just hope that he doesn't, like, that he just didn't die young in this shitty situation, because he did. Him and Sacagawea both deserved like what felt like the world, and they were given nothing, you know? Like, so unfortunate. And meanwhile, Lewis and Clark are the ones who get all the like praise, and like they're the ones that we talk about more than Sacagawea or York. I didn't know about York before I did my research. Like, and that was heartbreaking to learn about this person who did all of these things just to be rewarded with nothing. Like, fuck, man, that sucks.
Yeah, and in fact, we will give credit where credit's due, and we will start a movement here to call this the Sacagawea and York expedition, um,
Absolutely.
of which Lewis and Clark were willing participants.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Hired by the president. End of story. Like, York and
Absolutely.
Sacagawea were the real members of the Corps of Discovery. They were the real leaders of the Corps of Discovery.
I'm hopeful that somewhere out there is an alternative reality which points towards that story, and maybe somebody there will somehow listen to our podcast and say, "Wow, these guys knew what they were talking about."
Yeah, I
Um,
hope so.
yeah, that would be nice if somebody can think that. We'll be extremely happy. Yeah, Aidan, it's amazing. I actually, when doing some of the research, I thought, okay, are we going to have enough material here? And then you're like, oh my God, we've been here talking for an hour and a half, and we probably had to cut God knows how much of the
Yeah,
story. But maybe at some point we'll refer back to it in some ways. But thank
I'm
you very
sure that
much. Yeah, go on.
yeah, I'm sure that we'll talk about like some of the things that they come across later on, and like I think it'll be a good place to start with James Madison, and like kind of talking about what this is going to do for James Madison. Um, but I'm just super excited to keep going with the podcast. Hopefully it's not going to be another 3 weeks before we sit down and do this again. That was
I'm pretty hopeful that
yeah,
this over the Christmas period we'll find some more
yeah,
opportunities. But you're right. Next up is Madison, I believe, and so
yeah,
this will follow very smoothly into that particular story as well.
yeah.
Aidan, thanks a lot for the research, your thrilling enthusiasm, and the raw way in which you express yourself, which people are definitely becoming familiar with. Next time, I hope will not be too far away.
Yeah, fingers
Two
crossed. I have a good feeling
and
about it.
a mic. Two and a mic. Two, 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 two and a mic. Two